Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, second part thereof for the 6th of May 2025. This is a geopolitical video and we're going to start with, I did a breaking news update and analysis on this earlier, but we're going to return to the Romanian presidential election. I do have some hopes. Well, just to remind you, if you haven't seen the video, to let you know, and if you have seen it, to remind you, the far-right candidate for the AUR, George Simeon, got 40.9% of the vote in the first round of the elections, and the rest of the field was split, so that second place got about 20.9% of the vote. And for the second round, Dan, who's this mayor, kind of an independent mayor, but would be much more pro-EU and Western oriented than George Simeon. Those two are going to run off. He would need to coalesce all the rest of the votes against George Simeon. So George Simeon would have to, or those of us who want Romania to remain looking towards the EU rather than looking towards Russia and MAGA, would hope that essentially that far right vote is already topped at sort of 40%. Now that there is some form for that in these sorts of elections, and actually that all the other kind of centrists, centre right, centre left, and liberals are all and far left are all split among the rest of the vote. And actually there is some good indications that Dan could really get a sufficient number of people to coalesce around that anti-far right sentiment. So it's not all is lost, but it is deeply, deeply worrying still. There is this tend towards the far right. And I was pulled up by someone saying, look, you talk about far right populism, but what about far left? You know, as in I'm biased and whatnot. The reason I keep mentioning far right populism is because that's actually taking hold in European and Western politics in a way that far left populism isn't. You could argue that there's an element of that in Brazil, okay, with Lula against Bolsonaro. But actually, that's a fairly establishment party over there, De Silva's. And when we look at European politics and American politics, you know, you've had a rejection of right-wing populism or the general right that was kind of siding a little bit with MAGA in the rhetoric. A rejection of that by Mark Carney in Canada and Anthony Albanese in Australia. But those parties weren't left-wing populist parties. They were establishment parties on the centre-left, right? Just bog-standard, normal politics. I keep talking about far-right populism because there is no really meaningful far left populism that is having an effect on European and Western politics. MAGA republicanism is, I think, right-wing populism, and I think it's dangerous. MAGA and that's why I keep saying MAGA republicanism, to differentiate it from, say, Reagan republicanism. You go to France, you got Rassemblement National. You go to Germany, you got Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. You go to Hungary, you've got Orban and Fidesz. You go to Slovakia, and actually Robert Fico started as a kind of left-wing populist, but has now gone into coalition with the far right and has moved his party into right-wing nationalism. You go to Italy, and you've got three right-wing, actually I would say far right with some of it, three-party coalition on the right, which I think is right-wing populism again. Now, Giorgia Meloni might be supportive of Ukraine, but the other two parties, brothers of Italy, if I don't know how unified they are around Ukraine, but at least Giorgia Meloni is, but the other two parties aren't, right? And you know, Vox in Spain, you've got these right-wing parties. PIS in Poland is slightly different because of the history of Poland and Russia, but actually the Confederacy in Poland is pro-Russian. In fact, when you look at that kind of right-wing populism, this is Grzegorz Brown tearing down an EU flag and wiping his shoes with it. So far-right Polish MP Brown once again sparked outrage, this time ripping down the European Union flag and wiping his shoes with it during an official parliamentary intervention at the Ministry of Industry in Katowice. But this isn't so. Darren Corrigan was like, be careful about what you say. What about far left populism? But far left populism is just not gaining purchase among the electorates of Europe, particularly. As far prove me wrong. And so it is, I'm afraid, the right wing that's doing this, and Reform UK I would throw in with that as well, with their regurgitation of MAGA talking points and policy. And so I think we are seeing the rise of the right, and I think that's easy. It's an easy pill to swallow for many in the electorate because of issues with immigration and social cohesion that can also easily be over-egged and certainly focused upon, I think, in a way that probably isn't reflective of reality as much, but is still definitely an issue for many, many people. And so fear sells more easily than joy, and I think the far right has an easier job of throwing its views onto the electorate and finding those views land on fertile ground. So that is why I keep talking about right-wing populism. Okay, where populism is, and I can get my book on it over there, I would define populism as a bottom-up movement of the people manipulated by a sense of otherization, where it's them against the political elites. So it's a political movement driven by people who are trying to get the people to go against the elites at the top, whether they're moneyed individuals or political establishment individuals. So the EU would be the political elite, the political establishment. You're trying to get people to rise up against that. But the problem is, in the US, we've had that where the Democrats have now begun to represent the political establishment, and the Republicans appear to be these upstart, rebellious Tea Party type people. But actually, they're kind of biting the hand that feeds them often. And with the MAGA republicanism in the United States, they've ended up installing an oligarchy, which are the more elite than you can possibly imagine. And that's what they're putting in place. There are more billionaires in the Trump administration than ever before. So you get these weird contradictions that turn up. But certainly in the EU is seen as a political establishment, and you're trying to rise people up against that. But when it comes to the right, you're doing that in the context of nationalism and anti-immigration and so on and so forth. That gets largely built into right-wing populism. And I did my thing on reform the other day, and someone tried to, they end up getting banned because they were just a troll, but trying to say that reform isn't populist. And it's like, no, it literally is like defined, it's like given as the example of populism in many sort of textbooks and website definitions and stuff. So they are very much a populist movement on the right. But in order to try and maintain a power in a broad, in a electorate with many different views, like in the UK, reform is having to start to dabble with some left wing, economic particularly policies to try and keep the working class or on the left in their electorate, in their base, because they stole them. Well, they didn't steal them. They attracted them over Brexit, and then have kept them, and they need to do that by offering them some carrots that aren't typically right-wing populist policies. Anyway, going back to Romania, Adrian P. here from Romania says the anti-EU Simeon got over 50% of the vote in my home village. I will skip the anger and just express how clueless they are. Most houses have solar panels gotten through an EU-financed program that covered 90% of the installation cost. Many enjoy direct payments financed by the EU as agricultural subsidies. Some have bought agricultural equipment and expanded their farms by accessing EU structural funding. The village was dirt poor when I was a kid in the 90s, and the biggest employer was a village bar where they sold one type of chocolate and just Pepsi. The rest was cheap alcohol. If you wanted to make a phone call in 2000, there were 3 phones in the entire village. Now everyone has a smartphone and TikTok and high-speed internet and costs less than $10 a month. Today we have 2 supermarkets where you can even get an avocado if you want. There are multiple small farming businesses, gas stations, construction businesses, a hardware store, even a pharmacy and a hair salon. If you go to the parking lot of the supermarket, which also has a cafe, you can't see a car older than 5 to 6 years, and there are some BMWs and Audis sprinkled in too. But fuck the globalists. We should take our country back because a football hooligan dressed in traditional clothing said so. Now, what's really interesting there is this is exactly the point, is that Romania has gone through a period of unprecedented growth and increased wealth and distribution of that wealth as well because of its position in the EU. And when you go to Poland, this is what's fascinating to see this dingbat here take the EU flag down and wipe his shoes with it, is that Poland has been an absolute beneficiary of its EU membership. It's gone through this period of massive growth because of its EU membership. Its economic boom time has been very closely, it's not just correlated with, it's been caused by its membership of the EU. And yet you get to this position where they can just walk around and diss the EU left, right and centre. I'm not trying to be overly pro-EU here, but it's just weird that you get in Romania and here in Poland, among some people, this idea that it's a populist idea that these elites are terrible and it's all awful. Well, actually, hang on. How come you are spending this much more on defence in Poland than any other nation? Where are you getting all this money from? How are you experiencing this boom time? Well, okay. Well, why are you biting the hand that feeds you? And it's all just grifting on the EU to generate a nationalist movement that ends up biting the hand that feeds it. It's absolutely incredible. Now, Poland has announced that it's facing unprecedented Russian interference ahead of the presidential election. According to a minister there, the country will hold their presidential elections on May the 18th, with a potential runoff on June the 1st. So it's so just constant. As someone says, we don't get a minute's peace. It's just like one challenge after another. Okay, talking about Russia and the influence that Russia is having on our own politics, Keir Starmer in the UK is saying that we in the UK need to prepare for an attack by Russia. Britain is secretly preparing, says the Daily Telegraph, for a direct military attack by Russia amid fears that it's not ready for war. Officials have been asked to update a 20-year-old contingency set of plans that would put the country on a war footing after threats of attack by the Kremlin. And of course, things have changed, and now we've got drones flying around and doing so much as they are in Ukraine. It's about time that we have contingency plans in place that reflect the hybrid warfare that's taking place and the modern battlefield. Now, we're going through a whole defence review that will be looking at that as well in the UK. But, how prepared are we? And I would argue probably not prepared enough. Now, there was the 80th anniversary of victory in World War II, where Ukrainian soldiers took part in a London parade marking the 80th anniversary. They marched past the Royal Box and were greeted with applause, and King Charles III honoured them with a military salute. What I find interesting about looking at stuff like this is the difference between marching between the nations. With many nations, the UK, we're much more kind of like straight armed, left, right, left, right. So many other nations bring their marching across their body and is much more, I guess, performative maybe to a degree. more performative than in the UK. But anyway, let me know what you think. You know, you can. Our arms are much more casually, just as we'd normally walk, not being brought across the body in a particular fashion. You often see that as you go east, actually, I think more so, but maybe not. Let me know. Okay, let's go to Czechia, where Zelensky has been visiting Czechia and the Czech Parliament to the previous 2 days. During his visit to the Parliament, he did get to pose with photos with the Ukrainian women who were there as cleaners. The moment was captured by Czech photographer Daniel Moravec, and it speaks louder than words. And there's this kind of, grabbing him round the arms, and I guess, home from home type thing. And I think that's quite nice that he gets that appreciation from Ukrainians in Czechia there, so that was nice. Now, talking about Brazil and the government over there, we got Lula da Silva here, plans to offer Putin Brazil's mediation in Ukraine peace talks during his May the 9th visit to Moscow per Globo. Lula believes Brazil has the authority and that he personally has the influence to help make that deal happen. I think Brazil have disappointed me. Lula's disappointed me in their positioning with regard to Russia. I was hoping they'd move away from Bolsonaro's. Well, they have to some degree. Bolsonaro is very much pro-Russian. The problem is that there's a dependency on Russia in terms of fertilizers. There's an economic integration of the two nations that I think is possibly intractable to some degree, and that could compromise Lula's positioning. And he hasn't been pro-Ukraine at all in any overt way. In fact, by all accounts, not answering 6 telephone calls for meetings and whatnot. So, Brazil could be seen as one because they are somewhat in the middle, but they're not really. I think they're more over to Russia's side. At least it appears that way to me. The interim head of the US Embassy in Ukraine has arrived in Kyiv. Julia S. Davis, I know nothing about her, arrived following the resignation of Bridget Brink, who had served there since 2022. She is pretty decent for Ukraine, but then I guess just struggled to toe the party line with regard to where the Trump administration has taken its approach to Ukraine. Now, I talked about this in my last video on the Romanian elections. This is deeply, deeply worrying. American conservatives behind Trump's Project 2025, the blueprint for Trump's rulership, really, policy-wise, and the mechanics of government. Project 2025 was written by the think tank the Heritage Foundation, which is a very strong Christian nationalist kind of positioning. Would have been more kind of Republican, classic Republican in previous times, maybe somewhat similar to the AEI, American Enterprise Institute, but actually more recently has gone really down a particular route. And they, I think, are largely responsible for what the Trump administration is doing and how they are doing it. They have apparently, they are behind taking on the European Union. They met recently on March the 11th in Washington to discuss dissolving the EU institutions at a retreat. The proposal calls for abolishing the European Commission and renaming the bloc the European Community of Nations. Project 2025 is a detailed plan to transform the US government into a more centralized, conservative institution with a focus on Christian values, deregulation and hardline immigration policy. While it's not formally Trump's official plan, the personnel connections and early actions of his second term show considerable alignment with the proposals. The plans remain controversial as both supporters see it as a necessary reform and critics see it as a threat to democracy and civil liberties. So Heritage Foundation and allies discussed dismantling the EU, and I did report that back in March, right? But it's just well worth remembering these things when you see George Simeon, the AUR far-right representative and former football hooligan, gaining all this traction as a presidential candidate, and he wears MAGA caps and is pro-MAGA, and you see all of these AfD, for example, all of these Eurosceptic parties in Europe being supported very explicitly by Elon Musk, JD Vance, Marco Rubio, the Trump administration in general. And it's deeply worrying. I think the Trump administration is hell-bent on seeing the EU disintegrate. And we need to be wary about that. Even countries like the UK that are not in the EU. And the disintegration in the EU is not to anyone's benefit, I don't think, globally. I think you would go through a massive period of global instability. And Europe would be carved up between Russia, China, and the US. It would be an absolute disaster. And indeed, Republican voters increasingly view the traditional US allies, such as Canada and the EU, as hostile. Since 2016, the share of Republicans calling Canada or the EU unfriendly or an enemy has surged to nearly 30%, while Democratic views have remained low and stable, under 10%. Look at what's happened in the last 6 months plus with regard to Republican views on the EU. So they were going down. The EU as being seen as allied, and then somewhere around 2024, the EU became an enemy or unfriendly, and Canada likewise. Just absolutely incredible stuff there. Really, really worrying. Now, the EU has launched a €500 million initiative for 2025 to 2027 to lure top global researchers, especially those disillusioned by the US science funding cuts under Trump. So the whole DOGE cuts to NIH, and National Institute of Health, and other science funding organizations and research organizations, they've been decimated by Trump 2.0. Now the EU is putting together a package to lure some over. The plan includes long-term grants and aims to make Europe a safe haven for science, with support from Emmanuel Macron there. So interesting. Now, Trump apparently gave no instructions to cut off aid to Ukraine. The order to temporarily suspend military aid to Ukraine came from the office of Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth, according to Reuters, taking the White House by surprise. So the aid was restored a week later. You remember, aid was stopped, and then also intelligence sharing. But that didn't come from the Trump White House. It came from Pete Hegseth in the Pentagon. Senior officials could not provide an answer, as to why that happened. Reuters reports order by Hegseth to cancel Ukraine weapons caught the White House off guard. Wow, absolutely incredible there. And again, this goes to the sense of chaos and lack of coherence in the Trump White House. It really, really does. Now, on the other hand, you've got Mike Pence here on CNN. Pence breaks with Trump on Russia and Ukraine. Actually, he's done that previously. This is nothing particularly new. The past 3 years teaches us anything. It's that Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Ukraine, says Pence. Let's go and get a minute's worth of this.
Well, I think if the last 3 years teaches us anything, it's that Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Ukraine. And the fact that we are now nearly 2 months following a ceasefire agreement that Ukraine has agreed to, and Russia continues to delay and give excuses, I think confirms that point. Look, I've met Vladimir Putin. I have studied his leadership in Russia over the decades, and I really believe that Putin only understands power. And it's the reason why in this moment we need to make it clear that the United States is going to continue to lead the free world, to provide Ukraine with the military support they need to repel the Russian invasion and achieve a just and lasting peace. The wavering support the administration has shown over the last few months, I believe, has only emboldened Russia. Well, I think of the last 3
Really good to hear him say that. It shouldn't come as a surprise. This should be what all American politicians are saying. But alas, Mike Pence, not someone I used to agree with an awful lot, but he's kind of standing up for that old school traditional Republican positioning that we have just seen diminish at an incredible rate of knots, not just in the last 6 months, but actually the last 8 years, I think. Now, Donald Trump has said he's had a very good and productive telephone conversation with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, concerning many subjects, including the war in Russia, with Russia and Ukraine, all things Syria, Gaza, and more. President invited me to go to Turkey at a future date, and likewise, he will be coming to Washington, D.C. During my 4 years as president, my relationship with President Erdogan was excellent. So this is actually true, or at least Trump loves himself a bit of Erdogan, because he was one of these democratically elected leaders that has taken more and more power over time, although he's done it much more slowly than the Trump administration has done in Trump 2.0. But he's always looked towards Trump, towards these strongman leaders, and Erdogan is definitely one of them. In fact, I think that's why they kind of left the Kurds to dry under the Trump administration. One of the two foreign policy absolute disasters. Well, three, actually, if you include creating the Doha Agreement to pull out of Afghanistan, that was a disaster. The other one was leaving, hanging the Kurds out to dry in Syria was disgusting. That's what Trump did. I remember writing an article on that. I was absolutely incensed at the time. And then Helsinki press conference with Vladimir Putin, I thought was just the pinnacle of wrongness. So he's always liked a bit of Erdogan, but the thing with Erdogan is that he's not going to be a big fan of Israel doing stuff in Gaza, and the Trump administration has essentially given a carte blanche to people it's just insane, actually, to Israel to do what the hell they want with regard to Gaza. I'm actually going to find this statement. Give me a second. Yeah, so here it is. It is from the Bulwark. Quoted here by Mehdi Hassan, but it's from the Bulwark, where Erdogan is going to be supportive of the Palestinians in Gaza to a much larger degree than he is going to be supportive of Israel. And the US under Trump has given Israel carte blanche to do what the hell they like. And this is resulting in increased numbers of people then starting to die again in Gaza. And now it looks like the Israeli Defense Forces are going to basically take the entirety of Gaza. That seems to be militarily on the cards, and it's all pretty disastrous. And if you remember when Biden was in charge, and I made some comments on this on Facebook some time back, saying that all these people that were protesting Biden at these universities and here and there, where are they now? Why is there not a single protest when Trump is doing things far worse for Palestine than Biden ever did? Like, far worse. It's absolutely incredible. It blows my mind. And I got taken to task by a couple of proper left-wing friends who are actually starting to be more aligned with Russia themselves, because they believe all the kind of anti-NATO yada yada yada. They started having a go at me for my position there. I was like, no. This is about. I'm not saying that the Palestinians are to blame or anything like this. I'm saying the supporters in the United States or the pro-Palestine supporters have double standards, because they were protesting vociferously under Biden and have been absolutely silent under Trump. While Biden could hardly step outside the White House during his last year in office without being confronted by pro-Palestine activists, and Harris was frequently interrupted by protesters on the campaign trail, it has not gone unnoticed that Trump rarely, if ever, faces a heckle. No demands are being made for him to call for a ceasefire. No threats are being made to ensure that the Arab and Muslim voters who supported his campaign stay home will switch back in 2028. I saw a poll that just came out that the Muslim voters in the United States are split: a third Democrat, a third Independents, and a third Republican. And yet you're thinking, hang on, what's going on? Is there just all this cognitive dissonance, insanity going on, where they can't handle the fact that the people they might have voted for appear to be doing exactly the wrong things for advancing kind of social cohesion with Muslim communities and, supporting Israel in the destruction of Muslims and Palestinians in Gaza. It's just incredible. I mean, this is absolutely on point. No threats are being made to ensure that the Arab and Muslim voters who supported his campaign stay home or switch back in 2028. Just an incredible silence there. And so it's interesting to see what will happen with the relationship between Erdogan and Trump. Trump says we worked together closely on numerous things, including the fact that he helped return Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was imprisoned, back to the United States immediately upon my request. In any event, I look forward to working with President Erdogan on getting the ridiculous but deadly war between Russia and Ukraine ended, all caps, now. This kind of rhetoric really pees me off, I have to be quite honest. To call the war ridiculous, I think, is a word that really belittles the sacrifice that many Ukrainians are making. The ridiculousness is an understatement of the horrific decision for Russia to invade. It's not ridiculous, it's horrific. And the culpability for that is not both sides. It is on Russia. It's on Putin. And the fact that Trump never says this shows the moral vacuousness of Donald Trump. He's just a horrible human being. Now, Mark Carney is over in Washington ahead of meetings with Trump. Of course, Trump said ahead of that, I don't really know why he's coming over here. I don't know what he wants. Of course, he wants to sort out the deteriorated relationships between the two otherwise strongly allied neighbours. Anyway, Mark Carney said Canada and the United States are strongest when we work together, and that work starts now. Be interesting to see how that all goes, to be honest. Now, Georgia. This is good news. The US Congress has just passed a historic bill that strikes at the heart of Georgian Dream's regime. It labels Georgia Dream as pro-Kremlin, mandates sanctions, freezes aid, and declares the government unfit to lead a Western-aligned Georgia. This changes everything, says Terje Helland. This is the Megrabari Act, right? And it seems to have passed. For the first time, Georgian Dream is officially designated by a major Western power as a pro-Russian force working against Georgia's democratic and Euro-Atlantic future. Their facade of pro-European stability has collapsed in full view of the world. The law mandates global Magnitsky Act-style sanctions within 60 days. Targets will include Ivanishvili's inner circle, top officials behind repression, and those rigging elections or abusing civil society. This cuts deep into the foundations of GD's power. Now, this is what American politics should be. A bipartisan support for bills like this. Yes, let's get back to normality, please. All US security aid to Georgia is now suspended unless the government proves it respects democracy, rule of law, and free elections. No more blank checks, no more illusions. This is not just diplomatic pressure, it's a formal international indictment of Georgian Dream's legitimacy. A government sanctioned for attacking its own people and aiding Kremlin interests can no longer pretend to lead a pro-Western nation. For Georgia's civil society and democratic opposition, this is the lifeline. The West is no longer watching silently. It will act now with sanctions, support for media and activists, and a clear message: you are not alone. Of course, that support for media and activists, if it's going to be financial, will fall foul of the foreign agents law that Georgia have not only brought in, but they've made even stronger. So that's a challenge. But this is all moving in the right direction as far as the US is concerned. The US has drawn a line. If you crush democracy, silence critics, and serve Moscow's interests, you'll pay a price. Georgian Dream should be an international pariah, and Georgia's democratic future just got a powerful new ally. Well, let's hope that the US can stand by that bill and support liberal activism in Georgia at a time it most desperately needs it. Now, talking about Germany, Olaf Scholz has just ended his tenure as the German Chancellor, and he spoke to the Ukrainian President Zelensky on a phone as one of his last things, which was kind of nice. In a phone call, Scholz emphasized, among other things, Zelensky's leadership and the courage, bravery, and determination of the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian people against Russian aggression. So that was good news. Now, Germany is going through a day of turmoil at the moment. So first of all, coalition agreement has been signed in Germany between the SPD and the CDU-CSU. The main issues were migration, the economy, and defense. A separate issue is Ukraine, which is mentioned 17 times in the agreement. Germany recognizes Ukraine as a key factor in European security and promises to support it from a position of strength, that is, without compromises with Russia. It also confirms its commitment to the prospect of Ukraine's membership of NATO and advocates for Ukraine's accession to the EU. So this is really important. Bipartisan support for Ukraine from the two coalition partners. Germany's new coalition deal backs Ukraine's EU NATO membership, pledges continued military and financial support, and the use of frozen Russian assets, but makes no mention of the Taurus missiles, interestingly. Okay, so that's good. But then we hear today that in the big sadly, a big first in German politics. Friederich Merz, the Chancellor-designate, didn't get the votes to become the Chancellor in what's now going to be the first round of votes, because normally you would get through on that first round and it's kind of a formality. So he needed 316, so I presume that's half of the 630 needed, half plus one. He needed 316 votes. He got 310 for. There were 307 against, 3 abstained. So that's a little bit less than half, actually. So that's 620. But anyway, the vote failed and the session's been paused. Round 2 will be on the cards. The analyst says Friedrich Merz fails to win the vote for Chancellor despite having the majority he needed. 316 votes. It says out 360, but I'm sure it must be 630. Anyway, but clearly someone wasn't playing ball, and he received only 310. The coalition has 328. So why would not every single member of the coalition vote for him? And this is what they're going to be trying to find out now. This is an absolute disaster. The rules require a second vote, possibly on Friday if parties don't waiver time limits. There can be repeated votes on a second attempt, but if that too fails to produce a chancellor, an immediate general election is called. This just plays into AfD's hands. This is ridiculous. Just absolutely ridiculous. So, there is a unity amongst the establishment parties in Germany for supporting Ukraine. And if it all goes wrong, that's an absolute disaster. Anyway, there you go. That's enough from me. That's the geopolitical update for Europe and beyond, mainly concerning Ukraine. Hopefully that's of interest. Please remember, we are still running the Easter campaign for Car for Ukraine. We are almost at the 17,000 mark. There's been some more donations given today. So thank you very much today for Tracy Assel and Derek Hume for adding their support to this. Really, really appreciated. Anyway, in the meantime, take care of yourselves. Toodle pips.